Right. Good evening and welcome everybody to tonight's Standards Committee meeting. If I can, I just ask you to either put your phones on silent or switch them off. Save some embarrassment during the meeting. Do we have any apologies other than Councillor Axwell?
The chair.
No? Okay. Late items to be introduced by the chair. I have none to introduce. Declarations of interest, anybody? No? Okay, minutes of the meeting held on the 31st of October last year, that is. Does anybody want to go through them, or are you all okay with it? Yeah, okay, thank you. Standards Committee.
Minutes of the 19th December as well.
Oh, sorry, I forgot about that one. You just looked at that. The 19th of December as well. Is everybody okay with the minutes of that? Yep, okay, thank you.
You to comment? No, it's only, in fact, the chair to comment. Are you happy with them?
Yes, I'm happy, yeah.
No one to second.
See, there's only 3 elected members here. Standards Committee forward plan. Alex, are you going to talk us through this, or is it Emily?
I'm happy to talk you through this one, Chair. So this is a standing item on the agenda for basically the Standards Committee that just allows the committee to plan out its future work programme. I believe this is the penultimate meeting of this municipal year. So really it's an opportunity for the, I think it's quite a municipal year, is that right, Stephen?
There's one more in March.
There's one more, okay. Well, this is an opportunity then for the committee to request any particular agenda items for the March meeting. As you'll see, I think on the forward plan, we've considered several items on over the course of this municipal year that this committee has requested in the past. The only one currently remaining on the forward plan is a look at the protocol relating to access to facilities and resources by councillors, which has some tangential links into the standards process, but my colleagues and I would be happy to take any items away that the committee wants to see brought forward and bring something back to the March meeting.
Okay. Councillor Patterson, anything?
When we say access to facilities, and the other part one, what exactly is that referring to?
So that's predominantly around councillors' entitlements to use the council's resources in undertaking your roles. So your access to IT facilities, access to support through what we traditionally call member services. And there are some rules in there around the appropriate use of those facilities, as you would expect, to prevent misuse of those resources for political purposes, for example.
Yeah.
So they do have some links into the standards process, and I think that any alleged breach of that protocol would be dealt with as if it were a complaint under the council complaint procedure.
Councillor Graves, anything? No? Okay, moving on to item 6. Councillor Training and Development.
That's another one from me, Chair. Thank you. So this report was one that was included on the forward plan. I think this committee had previously expressed an interest in looking at the training programme, the annual training programme that we set for councillors, particularly in relation to any training that might be needed around the code of conduct or standards and ethical practices in general. The report presents the councillor training and induction programme as it was set for last year. As the councillors on this committee will be aware, typically the council sets its training programme for the forthcoming municipal year at the February meeting of full council. So there is currently a report being drafted at this moment in time. And this is really an opportunity for this committee to comment on what they may wish to see included from a standards perspective on that training programme. Our councillor training programme currently conducts a sort of 3 different elements. Firstly, there is the induction process. Now that, with the move to whole council elections, that obviously only takes place once every 4 years now, but there was an induction process that took place in May and June of last year for all councillors, even those who'd served on the council previously. There is an annual councillor training day where mandatory training as determined by the full council is completed in one opportunity, and contained within the report. Councillors and independent members will be able to see the training that is currently determined to be mandatory. That's at 4.2 of the report. So we currently have training around general principles of decision making and the legality of local authority decision making, specific training around councillors' responsibilities in relation to children's safeguarding and adult safeguarding, data protection and information governance. Councillors, for the purposes of their casework, are all registered as individual data controllers with the Information Commissioner, so they hold some fairly significant responsibilities and liabilities in terms of how information is managed. Of interest to this committee, all councillors undertake mandatory training on the Code of Conduct, and we also ask councillors to complete mandatory training in terms of their responsibilities as corporate parents to the City Council's looked after children. There is additional mandatory training for members of certain committees. So, for example, if you're appointed to the Planning Committee or the Licensing Committee, you may be asked to undertake compulsory training that is specific to those roles. As I mentioned, the full training schedule for 2023-24 is appended to the report. You'll see that we also now host, this is something that was new for the last municipal year, councillor training and development evenings. So they're a monthly opportunity for councillors to receive briefings or training on matters of relevance or emerging issues. And I would say that they've been reasonably successful so far this year. I'd say on average we have about 2/3 of councillors attend each session, and whilst we encourage as many councillors as possible to attend those sessions, we don't make them mandatory, and that is largely due to there's lots of demands on councillors' time outside of committee work. And councillors are trusted to come along to those sessions that they believe to be most relevant to their particular roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, I think some that missed one session joined in the next one, so it's quite good from that point of view.
You can see it paragraph 4.5, some of the topics that have been considered so far this year, and as I said, they've been reasonably well attended. Obviously, this report predominantly is an opportunity for the committee to reflect on any specific training needs, either for members of this committee or the councillor cohort more widely, in terms of upholding high standards of conduct and behaviour. Our current training offer, specifically relating to standards, includes an overview of the Code of Conduct and the working together councillor officer protocol as part of the councillor's induction process. Mandatory training, as I mentioned, at the councillor training day on specific elements of the Code of Conduct, particularly in relation to things like declarations of interest, and also elements of the councillor officer protocol. And the other thing is we've arranged next month for the Local Government Association to come and present at the monthly councillor development evening, specifically on issues relating to maintaining healthy, effective councillor officer relations. So that's something that's due to take place, I think, the middle of February. As detailed in the report, the Committee on Standards in Public Life has previously emphasised the need for training on standards in local government that should be scenario-based rather than necessarily compliance-focused. And I think we as officers recognise that as an area for improvement when reviewing our current training offer, because I think some of our existing training is more skewed towards that compliance side of things. So that's really about emphasising why it's important to the council that councillors uphold high standards of conduct when conducting their public duties. And that might seem self-explanatory, but sometimes it's important for those things to be worked through in maybe a workshop environment. So as we'll see from the subsequent report on the agenda this evening, I think we have to reflect that the 2023-24 municipal year has seen a really significant increase in the volume of complaints, and I'm sure Emily will come on to that when she presents the next report on the agenda. And it's important to note that not all of those complaints have been upheld, and there were good reasons for that. But I think it's important for the committee to consider the factors that might have been driving this trend, as officers who are tasked with maintaining public confidence in the council's democratic processes, I think it's important that we ask the committee to consider what steps might be appropriate in response to that increase in the volume of complaints. So, for example, we'd ask would the committee support more workshop-based training for councillors. We're keen to explore how councillor members of this committee could act as advocates for high standards of conduct within their respective groups, and also ask what role our independent persons could play in training of councillors or working through some of those issues. And a good example would be the resolution from the December meeting of this committee, where we agreed to create a working group to look at specific issues relating to the Code of Conduct, and that working group is due to meet for the first time in a couple of weeks. So really, I just introduce the report for further discussion, really, and reflections from members of the committee on what might be appropriate in terms of additional training that's required for councillors more generally or members of this committee.
Thank you, Alex. I mean, it's important that our training keeps evolving, you know, and not just have a set pattern, and the introduction of online training, etc., and, you know, looking at this. So, yeah, you know, as long as we don't just stick to a pattern and carry on, but anything that comes up, you know, if there's a new complaint that we haven't dealt with before, I think we should look at that and base some training around that as well. Anybody else would like to make a comment?
At the last meeting in December, I think there was a general lack of awareness about the complaints procedure and sanctions and that sort of thing. So I was wondering, is there training for this committee on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be something would be happy to consider. I think that probably could be extended to the councillor cohort more widely, and it's perhaps not a process that is fully understood until you're involved in it yourself, and not every councillor necessarily has been involved in it. So I think it would be something that would be beneficial for everyone, really, to just work through how that process works in practice and how complaints sometimes make their way through the system.
But it is possibly one or two councillors that have not been on this committee last time that were here, and that's probably why they didn't understand the full function of it. Did you want to add anything, Emma?
I was just going to reflect on the point that Alex made about the number of complaints. And I think it's also important for this committee to understand that not all concerns about behaviours manifest themselves in a complaint. But I think it's fair to say that Alex and I have, over the course of this year, seen an uptick in concerns raised about behaviours which may not have resulted in a complaint, but in terms of that interaction between members and officers, and I think that's an area where we do have some concerns, hence the session which we have arranged with the LGA to just work through some of that. And I think that's important for the committee to understand, that just what ends up within these papers is not the full extent of issues that we deal with, and obviously those issues are often dealt with through careful mediation by Alex, in particular between members and officers, and trying to resolve things as practically and pragmatically as possible. But I think it is important for that to be understood by this committee.
Okay, thank you.
Just on the point of where you mentioned we've seen a jump in complaints this year compared to last. What is that jump? Because I was just looking, I couldn't see like a comparable figure.
I think we've got the information is in the subsequent reports on the agenda. I don't necessarily think it will provide a like-for-like comparison with the last municipal year, but we can circulate that information to the committee. And I think also there have been some complaints received since that report was published that will not be reflected in the report. So the numbers might need to just be briefly reviewed, but we're happy to circulate those after the meeting.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that brings us on to number 7, volume and outcomes of councillor complaints for 23-24.
Thank you very much, Chair. This is obviously a standard report that you'll all be aware of, that just gives a summary of the complaints received and those which have been resolved. As members of the committee will see, we have had 12 complaints have been received at the point of writing this report in the municipal year 23-24. 10 have been resolved or dismissed and 2 remain live. As Alex mentioned, we have received some additional reports since complaints since the writing of this report. One thing I would highlight to the committee is that we have, as a group of officers, worked hard to bring complaints to resolution as quickly as possible. And at points in this municipal year, we have had brief periods where we've had no live complaints at all, which for those members of the committee who've been on the committee for a number of time, they'll know that we have had complaints which have gone on for quite a considerable amount of time. So we have looked to resolve complaints as quickly as possible where we can. That's not always possible where it removes an investigation. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, item 8, exclusion of press and public.
Read out the wording.
Sorry?
We need to read out the wording.
Okay. Is it this one?
No, on the other slide.
We just need the committee to agree the resolution.
Yes.
Right,
Agree the
sorry.
resolution.
Okay, to consider resolution to exclude the press and public during consideration of the following items that under section 100A of the Local Government Act 72, the press and public be excluded from a meeting during discussion of the following items on the grounds that they involve the likely disclosure of exempt information as detailed in, as defined in paragraphs 1 and 2 and part 1 of Schedule 12A of the Act, that the public interest in maintaining exemption outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information. Okay.